Hi, I'm Deanna McCarthy Perkins. Hello to everybody. I wanted to talk about Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's John Winthrop's City of Women. This is the article that I chose. Before I delve into that, I would like to give us a solid foundation on what she wrote about and why, so that we understand that time. We're talking about Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 17th century, mid 17th, early century. We're talking about Puritanism, breaking away from the Church of England. And the governor, the very first governor there that came on the ship, he did a sermon, and his name was John Winthrop. John Winthrop had this view of Puritanism when he came over and brought everybody, and he did this sermon on the ship about the city on the hill, and he said, basically, we need to go over there and we need to do right. We need to follow everything. And his very strong belief was that if one person did not follow in suit and line and didn't live a very pure life according to Scripture, that the whole community was going to be punished. So we keep that in mind. Also, from Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's point of view, she also, and this will be backwards because of recording, but good wives, women were called goodies back then. And she writes this book after this article, and she had even made a statement once about women that behaved never made history. I'll explain that in a second. But she writes about this book that this book really has less to do with Anne Hutchinson, but more about housekeeping, childbearing, and ordinary church going, about small conflicts experienced by forgotten women, and about little triumphs that history has not recorded. And this is important because her view when writing about that time period, and she is a Harvard professor, but she's retired now, she still writes historically, but she's a Harvard professor of early American literature and history. She was a Harvard professor on women's gender roles in early American history. And she says in an Idaho Public Television interview with Marsha Franklin on Dialogue about the histories, and this I'm bringing to the front her focus in this article. Historians' narrow interest, lack of ability of imagination to look beyond what would be the headlines. So she really wanted to pull together, using John Winthrop's journals, the view of the community, but mostly of women and how women were viewed. Women did have some roles, especially if their husband passed away. They were able to own land. They were huge in the community with supporting one another and, doing all of the women things. And he even discusses that, John Winthrop, not in his journal, but, and that's the transcript, but when speaking about another woman in his Puritan opinion of literary women, he says, for if she had attended her household affairs and such things as belong to women, and not gone out of her way and calling meddle in such things as are proper for men, whose minds are stronger, she had kept her wits and might have improved them usefully and honorably in the place of God had set to her. Women were revered in the community, but they were also looked at as they needed to be very responsible. This was a woman that was writing. No, you can't write, Anne Bradstreet, was that her name? Was the poet who was writing. She got away with it. But we didn't have a lot of women that were writing about things back then. So we had to rely on Winthrop, the governor, and he calls himself throughout the journal, the governor, what he had to say, but he left parts out, and he was a little bit dramatic. So in this article, John Winthrop's City of Women, she picks out certain models and behavior that happened back then, and one of them happens to be Anne Hutchinson. And what happened to Anne Hutchinson? She started preaching. It was going to the bedside, being with women in childbirth, and that led into eventually and ultimately her preaching in her home and having several people come. And honestly, this just about made him lose his mind, and being a lawyer and believing, oh no, you're stepping out of line, God's going to punish us all. And he winds up writing about that in his journal, and he says, she's excommunicated is what happens. She gets banished. She gets kicked out. Poor Mary Dyer comes later, who is another woman figure from that period. They wind up hanging her because she just wouldn't stop. So these women were standing up for, well, God spoke to me. That's what Anne Hutchinson says. And she says in her transcript, that God spoke to her. She said, I bless the Lord that he hath let me see which was clear ministry and which was wrong. And she also says that the deniers of the testament, that they did open up to me and give me to see that those which did not teach the new covenant had the spirit of Antichrist, and upon this did discover the ministry unto me, and ever since I bless the Lord. So she basically stood in a court that told her, you can't do this, you're stepping away from everything, shame on you. And they wanted her to say, okay, forgive me, and then she would be in grace with the Lord, because they didn't believe that there was another way to salvation and that you would know about it. The Puritans believed that you were born with sin, that you were going to follow through this whole path of life, and you had to do every little single thing right. And if one person in that community stepped away, then you were all in trouble. So he really believed this. And then babies that were born disfigured, he says in his journal, and she brings this up as well. God's displeasure at Mrs. Hutchinson shown by a monstrous birth. She's exiled, she's banished. They hung Mary Dyer. The babies, probably because of the land, or I did a whole other article in another class revolving around pesticides and how different pesticides were used. I mean, we're talking about Thanksgiving and different things like that. Well, pre-Thanksgiving, but we're talking about people who used agriculture and they ate. And then you have women that are also using home remedies and whatnot. So if you get medically involved with this, I'm sure there were other reasons, but according to the governor, the babies were born because it was the wrath from God. It's a very interesting article. It does bring us forward in how women must have felt at the time. The other citations that I have with this is John Winthrop's actual journal. I looked at the transcripts from the actual court where they banished Anne, and I looked at the sermon on the ship when he came over about the city. Of course, I also have the interview with the public television, and then John Winthrop's A Puritan Opinion of Literary Women, where he discusses about the woman, and several other resources. So thank you for listening. I hope I didn't run over too much. It's my first go with it. Good luck to everybody, and God bless.